We're going to be talking today about compensation, and all of the ideas here are coming from this book by Verne Harnish, author of Scaling Up and author of this tiny little book, but really good book called Scaling Up Compensation, 5 Design Principles for Turning Your Largest Expense into a Strategic Advantage. So let's get into it. And the first example that I want to put in front of you, just to give you an idea of the angle that we're looking at when we talk about compensation, is an example of two steel mills. So our first steel mill has an average hourly wage of around $18, and we've got a second steel mill with an average hourly wage of around $21. And so the question that I want to put to you is that, assuming that they have equal output and there's no other direct employment costs that are varying here, which steel mill has higher labor cost? And of course, you see that this is probably a trick question. You might be drawn towards choosing number 2, but you're wondering what maybe the answer is. And there's other critical factors here that we really want to know in order to answer the question which has higher labor costs, because it's not going to simply be based on the average hourly wage. So for example, the first steel mill produces in an hour, takes 1.5 hours to produce a ton. So HPT here is hours per ton. So 1.5 hours to produce a ton of steel for number 1, and around 1 hour to produce a ton of steel in the second mill, about a third less. But there are other factors too. Steel mill 2 in this example produces 63% less scrap. So the point to put here right at the front of this learning segment is that the labor rates, how much we're paying people, and specifically here how much we're paying per hour, is not really equal to your labor cost. We need to be looking at output as well. So the question here is all about productivity. So if we take these 4 car manufacturers, how might we want to compare them? How might we want to compare their productivity? There are obviously many factors, but for one thing, we'd certainly want to know how long does it take each of these to produce a car, and it can take a radically different amount of time to produce a vehicle for these different vehicle manufacturers. Jack Welch said it best when he said, less people paid more with a lower total wage cost. Less people paid more, lower total wage cost. Really, it's about how can you get superior results from your people rather than looking solely at how much we pay them. We take the example of Morgan Stanley, just $3 billion or so in profit. But really what I want you to look at here is how much profit they earn per employee. We compare that to Merrill Lynch, much smaller employee base, but much higher amount of profit per employee, and the daddy of them all, Goldman Sachs, with $8 billion of profit. Look at that staggering increase in how much profit there is per employee. Take a different industry altogether and take retail. So Walmart pay a relatively low average hourly wage in dollars of just $12.67. A look at what the revenue per employee here is, and particularly in retail, we often look at how much revenue we can generate per square foot. And Walmart, by the way, have a 50% staff turnover, which is generally the average for retail, the industry average. Compare that to Costco, who are notorious for paying much more per employee, and look how much they can generate in terms of revenue per employee, and nearly double the revenue per square foot of space. But look at that massive reduction in turnover, 24% turnover, and think of the costs that are involved in staff turnover. That figure alone makes a huge difference to these two models. So the principle here is really to hire good people, and we're told this all the time, to hire good people and get out of their way. But really, it's more than that. I think we should hire good people and support them. High-functioning teams are made up of high-performing people, but teams in which each individual is supported to do his or her best. We're also often told that one great person might equal 3 good people, and that can definitely be true. In some industries, it's far higher contrast than that. Programmers, for example, there's almost no comparison. One great person could be 100 times better than a good person, or really just infinitely better. The question, the thing here really is to worry about what people are doing, worry about what their output is, think about their productivity, not just about their cost on paper on either an hourly or monthly salary. So compensation is your biggest expense, and there's a few questions that we like to ask people here. Can you rationalize each individual salary? If somebody was to look at all of your salaries, could we actually rationalize those salaries based on the output that that individual is producing? Do you know what each individual is their output is? Does the compensation incentivize the right behaviors? And this is really critical. Are we using our compensation as a tool to move people in a direction to incentivize behaviors and to help them make decisions that are beneficial for the business, for profit, but also for customers as well? Really, is compensation driving results? Is it energizing your people or possibly draining them? Is it a demotivator for some reason? And does it help you support retention of talent? And we're going to try and answer all of those questions and help you build a compensation system that will essentially help you get this right and get it out of sight. Yes, what you pay your people is your biggest expense. There are very few businesses I've come across where it's not the biggest expense after cost of goods, but we obviously want you to see it as an investment. So diving into the content of the book specifically, so scaling up compensation, the ideas in the book are built around 5 core design principles. And the first, which really supports the other 4, is about being different and getting the cultural element of your compensation system right. And then the others are stacked up in this way because as we go up the scale, we're looking towards more team-focused design principles and focusing more on the long term. And the purpose of any compensation system is to drive value to your customers, help drive profits to your bottom line, and help build positive energy within your system, within your business machine. So when we talk about compensation, what are we talking about? We're talking about more than just money here. We're talking about the total rewards that your employees receive. That's elements of compensation that are essentially cash-based, other benefits they might receive, and other relational rewards, such as whether the work is itself meaningful, whether they have employment security. So when we're talking about compensation, we're talking about the whole package. And compensation is strongly aligned with both your culture and your strategy. These are reinforcing each other. Compensation system needs to reward the behaviors that you consider desirable. If you think that cooperation produces better results, then you should award team bonuses. If you believe your team will always work hard, then maybe you'll pay them a high fixed salary. If you don't, you might have a higher proportion of variable pay. And then all of these mirror each other. So how culture, how people treat each other, how people go about doing their work, how you want them to go about doing work should be reflected in your compensation scheme, and how your compensation scheme is set up will itself influence mirror back the culture of your business. So the first design principle is about being different. So it's about this alignment piece with your culture and strategy. And you've got to get that alignment right, or you risk it ultimately being rejected. So the first question that I ask people to complete on the worksheet is really, what are your beliefs about people? Is to start making some notes about how your culture and strategy align. Do you trust people to do hard work? Do you think actually the internal competition is how to produce the best work? What are your customers expecting? How do people produce the value that customers are expecting? Do they produce that by working as a team? Do they have to collaborate? Or again, is it individual effort? How do you drive that value to customers? So the first design principle is about thinking about your current culture, about your strategy, how you interact with customers, how much interaction there is with customers, and how much that is based on team effort. And make some notes down, first of all, to think about how your culture and strategy needs to interoperate with your compensation scheme in order for it to be accepted by people. The second design principle is called fairness, not sameness. So fairness, not sameness, this idea that fairness is not always treating everybody the same. So we often set salaries individually rather than using a scale. And this can backfire for a number of reasons. First of all, people might find out what each other earn. And also over time, if salaries are set entirely individually, then we might find that eventually we have somebody that's paying quite a lot. This often works against women, for example, because men typically might be more likely to ask for a salary increase, for example, or just whatever it is individually individual's nature. Might be that based on the way that somebody's asked for salary increases and they've been in the company longer, they may have a higher salary, but that's not necessarily reflective of the work that they do. So that's the first thing that we want to think about here, is our salaries being set entirely individually, or are we using a well thought out scale based on their skill level and their productivity level to set those salaries? The second question here is a problem that we see often, is that salaries might get tied to management responsibility. Makes sense. Why not? But what is the problem with that? Well, one of the main problems is that people then compete in order to get into management positions when management position may not necessarily be right for them. Why not give them an opportunity to continue to advance in their salary based on their continuing advance in their skill level, their competencies, and the work they're doing for customers, rather than them believing that they have to jump to management in order to get more money when management may not be where they're going to be best performing. And the failure rate for people being promoted into management sits at around 40-50%. So the reality is why don't we look for ways that we can advance people within a business without them jumping to management and risk losing what might be a very high performer? Another issue that we see is that tenure may influence pay. So tenure, how long somebody has been within the business. Again, length of service is not equal to performance. We always want to base our compensation systems around performance, not around external factors such as how long they've been with the company or what their rank is or where they sit on the org chart. And the final issue that we will sometimes see in compensation systems is pay structures based on criteria within their job, but their job-based criteria is quite an abstract and could change continuously. We really want to have their pay reflect what value they're producing for the company, what value they're producing for the customer, and how that fits within the overall value chain of the business. So the principle here is to have pay scales. So in this example, and this is taken from the book, but it's not a real example, it's a hypothetical example, is showing wide pay bands, but these pay bands have to be very clearly defined. So the first 7 pay bands in the darker color at the bottom, these are based on roles that might reflect people that are makers, so maker levels, so going up from trainee through pro, ace, wizard, maestro, etc., etc. And each of these bands would have very clearly defined criteria that allow somebody to progress through that band and at some point see themselves being promoted to the next band. But even within each band, they can potentially earn more even before they raise up to the next band. But critically, there's this large overlap with the whole second level in the organization. Here, this would be a leader level from coordinator through manager up to CEO. And you can see that most of this leader level pay structure, about 2/3 of it, is overlapped by the maker level. So people are able to rise up in the organization, continue to develop their skills, continue to develop the amount they earn, but based on clear criteria of their productivity, of the value they're producing for the organization, without necessarily having to jump to a leader level, without having to become a manager. And then again, even within manager level, we have clarity, and this is so often lacking in organizations, particularly at the higher levels, is clarity around what has to be achieved at each of those levels, and then progression through each of those levels that allow people to continue earning more money based on clear criteria beneficial for them as well as, of course, the company, that allow them to earn more without necessarily looking simply for a job title promotion. So the second exercise here is really to think about how you could create a pay scale. Of course, this can be done across the entire business, but what I'd really like you to think about initially is maybe just start with one role, a role that you have in your business that has multiple people performing that role, and define some levels, even if you just start out with a beginner, intermediate, advanced, and think about the criteria for those levels, the scope, complexity, how much interaction they might have, whether they need more or less supervision, and think about what those levels might be that you could split up that role into different levels, and then think about what the steps are, the progression that somebody must have to go through in order to get up to the next level. And whilst you're doing this, align it with your notes from Principle 1, align it with your culture and strategy, and all of the steps in this compensation exercise will be aligned with that first piece about culture and strategy. There is a really good blog post online from Buffer. Buffer were notorious about not only blogging about social media strategy, but blogging about their business as they grew. And they've got this fantastic blog post on how individuals advance at BAPA. And they've got a ton of information on all the different levels and competencies that people have to attain in order to move up through the business. So that's a great resource if you want to R&D, rip off and duplicate, and sort of see what another business is doing. Okay, on to design principle number 3, easy on the carrots. The metaphor here being that we often dangle a carrot in front of a donkey in order to get it to move forwards. So the idea here is that we often have variable pay. We often dangle the carrot. It's very common in businesses, but it's not always effective. A staggering 90% of companies offer some sort of variable pay somewhere in their structure. And what we're saying when we have variable pay is we're saying this is important. Move in this direction. And so we have to be very thoughtful about what we are moving people towards, and therefore what we might be excluding, what we might be blinkering them from in doing so. So the motive is to make people work harder. And this broadly accepted as something that works. It's something that we can all associate with. Pay them more and they would work harder. 80% of sales teams will have variable pay, and that will constitute typically as much as 40% of their total compensation. But it has issues, and actually in sales teams, a lot of sales teams now, and if you are interested in this and want to do some searching online, there is an increasing body of evidence suggesting that sales teams could be more effective without variable pay. But I'll let you do that research on your own. The thing here is to evaluate where you're using variable pay. So what are the issues with variable pay? First of all, they're highly individual, and it could act against client interest because people will be perhaps mono-focused in the area that gets them their bonus, and it may lead them to ignore other work duties. They can be difficult to track and measure. There's always the risk that people might cook the books, as it were. A lot of roles can be difficult to measure, and there are, as I say, there's a lot of studies now emerging that show that they can demote teamwork and reduce quality. So where it's very individual work, then carrots can work, but increasingly businesses are of course involved in teamwork, and it can be a demotivator. There's a very interesting book by the author Alfie Kohn called Punished by Rewards, which studies this in detail, and that's quite a read in its own right. But if you're more interested in how it can demotivate, and he looked not only about external rewards in the workplace, but also raising children, there's some very interesting reading there. Punished by Rewards, a fascinating read, whether you're a boss or a parent. So there are certainly conditions that are required for success with the concept of variable pay and dangling a carrot. Preferably a single focus role with an unambiguous goal, something that's easy to measure, where that person is working independently and where that person's not really expected to collaborate, cooperate and assist and help out other people, because unless they're getting remunerated specifically for helping other people, which is rare, then they're less likely to do that. And of course the incentive still has to be meaningful enough for it to have an effect. So it can't just be receiving some tiny bonus, or else people won't consider it. It has to be frequent enough that people feel that they can work towards it and receive their reward in a timely fashion. If they're only getting their bonus at the end of the year, and we'll come on to that, that's something quite different when we're looking at longer term rewards. So this is typically something that they would receive monthly for their performance in that month, or at the sort of longest stretch at the previous month. And of course employees want to be able to track this, so you often need dashboards in order to make this work. You have to gamify it. And of course the typical role where this is applied is in sales. It's very typical. It's not to say it's always effective, and that's something that I want you to consider, and you can go away and do your own research on that. There are some other examples that I've come across where it really does work. One business I work with, installing windshields. Very individual, very straightforward. So long as the work is done to satisfying level of quality, then somebody that installs windshields and goes out all day and does this by themselves, then adding some variable pay based on the piece rate of their completed work has been seen to be effective. So third exercise here, I want you to think about where you're currently using variable pay. Is it effective? So is it not only driving the right behavior, but is it also driving the right outcomes? Is there anything that you might improve here? Is it worth reconsidering the effectiveness of this? And maybe you can come back to that question, think about how effective variable pay is once we look at the other elements of a compensation plan. And of course, again, align it with principle one. So that might here mean thinking about how you want people to work as a team, which even in sales roles has changed dramatically, I would say, over the last 5 and especially 10 years, that we're very much looking more at team effort in many sales, particularly low velocity, high value B2B sales, whereas it used to be the idea of a lone ranger doing the sales. It's very much more a team effort, both before the sale and most definitely after in terms of delivery. And that's what we're going to get into next. So design principle number 4 is called Gamify gains. So the idea here is that we have gain sharing in order to influence people's decision making. And an example here from the book is a company called Mini Movers. I believe from memory they're based in Australia, and they're a home removal company. And they had a situation where they had a very high cost of insurance. And it was costing them about 3% of revenue, and it was rising. And it was a concern for them, especially when they weren't necessarily claiming very often. So what they decided to do was set aside 3% of their revenue and then distribute that quarterly to the teams that were doing the removals. But of course, the condition was that that only got distributed if nothing was broken. Of course, if something was broken, then that would have to come out of that 3% and it wouldn't get distributed. And the key thing here is that the way that this is set up, so both the quarterly distribution but also the reward itself, avoids habituation. So it doesn't become something that people expect, because occasionally there might be a breakage. So then they would get nothing. But if they break nothing over a quarter, and they've got to wait that whole quarter in order to get it. So it's the span of time is different to, say, a monthly bonus. And so have a think about how this influences behavior. And when I ask people this in workshops, of course, people start to imagine that people are being very helpful. If something is heavy, they'll say, hey, help me with this. Then I might throw in, well, what happens if you've got a new member of staff? Clearly, you would now be helping that new member of staff follow best practice rather than just letting them get on with it, because you're not leaning on your insurance as a crutch. You obviously want to make sure that you will get your distributed bonus. And of course, think about how this affects the customer. This is perfect for the customer. Now you might have a situation where you say to the customer, I see this is quite an old bit of furniture. Where do you want this? We're going to make sure we take care of this. We're going to strap it up. We're going to bubble wrap it, whatever it is. People are going to take care. So this is clearly influencing better decision-making, better collaboration, and better value for the customer, and a better position for the company. So why this works? It's specific, it's tangible, it's aligned with the strategy, it's converting the customer's expectation into behavior. And that's the clever thing here. If you can work this backwards, if you can gamify what is the customer's expectation, what does the customer want out of the situation? Obviously, it's very obvious here. They want all of their home goods and possessions to be moved without a single scratch or any damage. How do we convert that into how our employees behave? And of course, it's team-based. So it's a fantastic gamified system. Another example that I have is of a home automation business, and they had the example again from the book. If you want to look into this, a whole bunch of KPIs, typical stuff, GP, snagging days, but these were limiting their NPS scores. And what they wanted to do was to do the same as in the previous example, get people to work better as a team. It was requiring large teams, as many as 25 people, in order to complete a home automation installation project. How could we get people to work as a team? So in order to lift these NPS scores, what they introduced for the customer was a happiness guarantee. And the simple setup of this was that customers would get a 10% discount if they were not 100% happy. So a really high bar here. You're going to get a 10% discount if you're not 100% happy. So setting a really high bar for the customer. A customer could simply say they're not 100% happy and get 10% off their final price. And the way this was set up was that if the customer pays in full, that 10% gets split out between everybody that interacted with the client on that project. So the entire team, from people that initially went into quote, through to people that did the work, through to the final person that shook their hand and got the sign off. Again, think about how this influences behavior, particularly with project work. And so many of us now are involved in project work, if not with sort of physical installation project work such as this, but projects that are entirely based around knowledge work. There's a lot of handovers. And if we're motivating people to think individually, they may be motivated to do their best work, but they may not be that fussed about the handoff. And where we often see the ball being dropped in businesses is in that handoff. It's not necessarily in what any individual employee does, but in the gap between them and the next person in the project. In this example, you can imagine that everybody wants to not only do their best, but make sure that the handoff is absolutely perfect so that the next person in the chain is able to do their best as well. You're going to be checking with the customer throughout that everything is exactly how you want it to be before you try and sign off this project. And at the end, you're probably going to put a vase with a bunch of flowers and a bottle of champagne on their kitchen counter and say, "It's been an absolute pleasure. I'm so glad that you're 100% happy." So the principle here is, so when we're gamifying gains in this way, it doesn't always have to be monetary rewards. These two examples have been monetary, but there are lots of non-monetary rewards as well. Here are some examples. And non-monetary rewards often have a more substantial impact on performance than monetary rewards of equivalent value. There are lots of psychological reasons for this. Many of those actually come up in the book Punished by Rewards by Alfie Kohn. And you can have a think about why sometimes these non-monetary rewards have a more substantial impact. Simply for many people, the money isn't the main thing that matters. It can have a more lasting effect, a more emotional effect to have non-monetary rewards. So that's something for you to consider here as well. So what are the pros of gamifying gains? Obviously, it's mostly about collaboration and teamwork, particularly in the examples that I gave. And if you have this example in your own business where the service delivery to the customer is very much interdependent between multiple employees, possibly even multiple departments within your business. There are some cons. Do people want to depend on others for their pay or for an element of their pay? And depending on how the company is set up, top performers may not want to feel that they're subsidizing weaker performance. So you have to set this up in a way that reflects the overall performance of the organization, that you're still driving value to the customers and influencing employee behavior. Work it backwards from what customers expect and develop a scheme here that influences behavior in line with what customers expect. So the fourth exercise here is to think about what's important beyond just profit in terms of short-term results for the business. So particularly think about value for customers, project completion, success, customer happiness, etc., etc. And what team behavior you're wanting to drive. How can you put these together? Consider both monetary and non-monetary elements. Both are very important. And think about the time interval as well. Sometimes these will work better when they are spread out. And particularly in a lot of businesses, if we are not a very high-paced transactional business, then projects take a long time to pan out. So it would be more suitable both from a motivation point of view as well as how we measure these goals point of view to do it quarterly rather than monthly or immediately. But again, that's for you to think about. Okay, our final section here is called Sharing is Caring, and the principle here is getting people into an ownership mentality in the business. So getting people to feel that they have skin in the game. And the interesting thing is that whenever I teach this in a classroom with entrepreneurs, is that a very high proportion, I would say at least 75%, if not higher, have an interest in the idea of giving employees some sort of either ownership of the business or some sort of long-term profit sharing incentive in the business. Against stereotypes that entrepreneurs want to keep it all for themselves, I find quite the contrary, that people are very keen to connect people in a deeper way and more meaningful way for the long term in the organization. But the almost reverse, sort of 15% or so or fewer, sometimes barely anybody in the room has actually done it, and that's because they're just not sure how. It can be complicated. So, sharing is caring. So, it's not necessarily always about motivating people, particularly when it's long term. But of course, people's decision making will be very much influenced if they have a long term share in how well the business does. In certain industries, tech especially, it helps you compete for talent. And of course, it's very much encouraging employees so that so long as you've done good work in hiring A players, it encourages them to stick around, particularly if any bonus schemes, for example, are vested, i.e. the proportion of this year's profits you may receive this year, but some may go into the pot to be split out next year, and so on and so on. So vested schemes will very much influence people to stay around. So it can be very good for retention as well. Now, there are a whole bunch of mechanisms, and they vary very much by jurisdiction as to ways that this can be done, contractually, non-contractually. For example, in the UK, we have management incentive schemes, enterprise management incentive schemes, whereby we're essentially giving people shares that they would then be able to cash in upon sale of the business without paying the capital gains tax on the share. Well, they basically value the share at the date that it's given, and allow them to cash in upon sale. So for businesses that are looking towards an exit, you may very much be looking at shares. But if you're not looking at an exit scenario within, say, 5 to 10 years, then you may just look at simply some sort of long-term profit sharing system. And I've got a flow chart here based on some of these ideas. But again, it very much varies by jurisdiction. So if you want to do something that requires actual contracts and agreements in place, then of course speak to somebody that can advise you accordingly on that. And the key thing here is to plan ahead, to think in the long term. Something that can be demotivating about these schemes is if you bring everyone in on a profit sharing scheme, but there's a possibility that you may not have profit. And what you also want to avoid is bad profit. So you want to set up a scheme in such a way that doesn't cause people to generate profit for the business that might benefit them, but could deteriorate the experience for your customers. So a final exercise here is to think about how we might engage employees in long-term success of the business. And my examples here, my bullet points here are really focused around, say, for example, a profit share. So to think about what first of all the eligibility criteria for this is. So would you involve everybody? Usually that is the best way if you're going to do a profit sharing scheme, but sometimes it may be a minimum tenure. For example, been with the company for 6 months, 1 year, etc., etc. Is there a threshold so that you don't start giving out profits and sharing them from the very first dollar of profit earned? Because this can often be a concern for people. What if I set this up but it becomes difficult to actually cash flow it? So setting it up in such a way that maybe we earn X percentage of profit or X dollars in profit, and then after that threshold is met, then we start distributing. Do we put it into a pool? How is it distributed? Is it distributed equally? Is it distributed based on job level? Is it proportional to their base salary? So you add up everyone's salary, determine what their percentage of the total salary pool is, and that percentage is how you distribute. So think about the distribution and also think about the frequency. Annual, for example, is quite typical because, again, we're looking here at a team-based long-term sharing factor rather than something that is high frequency. Is there a vested element? So, for example, based on 100% of what they can earn, they get 50% in this period, 50% goes into the next period, and then again, next period, they get 50% of that year, and then 50% goes back into the pool. So that can be a way of helping with retention. And are there any other conditions that you want to place on the payout, such as free cash flow, customer satisfaction, other scores that you have within your business that may determine that you've not detrimented the quality of work and the quality of the customer experience? So that is your final exercise. I hope you found some value there and gets you thinking about some ways to improve your compensation scheme.